It began with a single shot, but its echo tore through continents. A war meant to end all wars, unleash devastation beyond imagination. This is the story of a world shattered and reborn. The world didn't march into war in a single moment. It slipped into it, step by step, blinded by pride, fear, and ambition. In the summer of 1914, Europe stood like a powder keg beneath a gathering storm. Great empires ruled vast territories, their leaders confident in their strength, their armies polished and ready. Yet beneath the surface, alliances knotted nations together in a web so tight that one spark could set the entire world ablaze. That spark came from a gunshot in the Balkans, a single act that ignited a fire none could extinguish. But that shot didn't start the war. It merely revealed the tensions that had been waiting to explode. Rivalries had simmered for decades. Borders had been drawn with arrogance. Nations had armed themselves with weapons more deadly than anything the world had ever seen. And when the first declaration of war was made, the rest followed like falling dominoes. Suddenly, millions were marching toward the front, young men who had been promised glory, adventure, and a quick victory. What they found instead was a nightmare carved into the earth. Trenches stretching hundreds of miles became their prison. Mud, rats, disease, and constant fear replaced the illusions of honor. Artillery thundered day and night, turning fields into wastelands and cities into fragments of memory. The war introduced machines capable of mass destruction. Tanks crushing through barbed wire, poison gas drifting across battlefields like a silent death, and airplanes turning the sky into another domain of fear. Humanity had entered an age where technology outpaced morality, and the cost was counted in millions of lives. But the battlefield was only half the story. Back home, families waited in uncertainty, nations rationed food and fuel, and economies strained under the weight of total war. Empires that had stood for centuries began to crumble under the pressure. Tsarist Russia collapsed into revolution. The Ottoman Empire disintegrated. The Austro-Hungarian Empire broke apart piece by piece. What began as a conflict between armies became a struggle for the future of civilization. By the time the guns finally fell silent in 1918, the world that had marched proudly into war no longer existed. New borders were drawn, new nations were born, and old powers faded into history. The cost had been unimaginable, a generation lost, landscapes scarred, and a global wound that would never fully heal. World War I was not just a war. It was a warning, a moment when humanity learned how isolated pride can destroy a world, and how long it takes to rebuild one. The world stood at a precipice long before the first shot was fired. Across Europe, power stretched in every direction. Vast empires glittering with pride, wealth, and ambition. On maps, these empires appeared strong and unshakable, their borders drawn in confident lines. But beneath that surface lay tension, suspicion, and a quiet dread that leaders refused to acknowledge. They believed their alliances would protect them, their armies would intimidate rivals, and their diplomacy would tame the storms gathering on the horizon. But the truth was far darker. The world was not stable, it was fragile, and the slightest crack in that fragile piece would send everything tumbling. This was a world built on competition. Monarchs measured their strength through colonies and armies. Governments boasted of naval power and industrial might. Each nation feared being outpaced by another, and the race for superiority tightened year after year. The alliances they formed were not symbols of friendship, but of fear. Countries bound themselves to partners, not out of trust, but out of the belief that enemies were lurking in every shadow. One wrong move, one misstep, one diplomatic insult, and the entire structure could collapse. Everywhere, national pride soared to dangerous heights. Newspapers fed their people stories of greatness. Schools taught children that their nation was destined to dominate. and political leaders stood before cheering crowds promising triumph and glory. This was not peace, it was a calm before a storm. A quiet moment before a disaster that everyone sensed, but no one could name. Behind the scenes, military generals prepared as if war were inevitable. Armies grew larger, weapons more devastating, and battle plans more complex. But still, nations insisted they wanted peace. The contradiction was fatal. The streets of the great capitals Vienna, Berlin, London, Paris bustled with life, oblivious to the catastrophe approaching. Citizens lived their days unaware that history was gathering momentum. An entire world enjoyed prosperity and cultural brilliance, while its leaders played a dangerous game of pride and power. They believed that their alliances made them strong, that their treaties would deter aggression. But these alliances were traps waiting to snap shut. Once one nation fell into conflict, others would be pulled in whether they wished to or not. It took only a single spark, a single act of violence to ignite this long-prepared tin. But long before that spark came, the world was already leaning toward the edge. Tensions in the Balkans had risen like smoke from beneath a closed door. Empires clashed over influence in regions they barely understood. Diplomats issued warnings that the great powers believed they could control events, believing they could intimidate smaller nations into submission. Instead, their arrogance ensured the coming disaster. The people living through these years felt the tension without comprehending its scale. Farmers in fields, workers in factories, mothers raising families all sensed that something was changing. Rumors of troop movements filtered through villages. Newspapers printed reports of political assassinations, border disputes, and declarations filled with fiery rhetoric. Ordinary citizens carried on with their lives, but the shadow looming over Europe grew longer with each passing month. They had faith in their leaders, believing those in power would guide them away from danger. But those very leaders were the architects of the crisis. The world on the edge was not marked by chaos, but by false confidence. Governments sent diplomats to negotiate peace while secretly preparing for war. Generals promised swift victory in conflicts that had not yet begun. Politicians convinced their people that they could not afford to appear weak. That strength was the only language rival nations understood. Pride trumped caution at every turn. Fear cloaked itself in the appearance of strength, and ambition disguised itself as duty. As alliances deepened, the web surrounding Europe tightened. One nation pledged loyalty to another, binding themselves into a system so rigid that once violence erupted, escape would be impossible. Leaders believed these alliances would prevent war, but in truth, they guaranteed it. The moment one nation was attacked, others would be forced to respond. The chain reaction would spiral beyond anyone's control. This was the world's fatal flaw. Too many promises, too much pride, too little wisdom. Tensions rose not only between nations, but within them. Populations grew restless, fueled by patriotic fervor and manipulated by propaganda. Young men brimming with enthusiasm imagined war as glory, adventure, and honor. They had no idea what modern weapons could do, no understanding of how technology had transformed the battlefield into a place where courage meant little. Against machine guns, artillery, and gas. Yet they cheered for war, believing their nations were invincible. Leaders did nothing to correct these illusions. In the final years before the descent into catastrophe, small crises struck again and again. Each time, nations stepped back from the brink, but each time, they stepped back with a new bitterness, a new grievance, a new score to settle. Diplomacy became a competition of threats rather than negotiations. Everywhere, the sense grew that the next crisis would be impossible to control. Still, no one imagined the scale of what was coming. They believed the world too civilized, too advanced, too modern for a war of total annihilation. They could not have been more mistaken. And so the world marched closer to the edge, blind to the abyss waiting below. Governments clung to their pride, armies polished their weapons, and nations strengthened their alliances. Everyone believed they were preparing for security. In truth, they were preparing for destruction. The world that stood on the edge was not doomed by a single event, but by years of arrogance, fear, and stubbornness. World building its own downfall, one decision at a time. Thanks for watching, and remember to subscribe for more journeys into our shared past. When that final spark came, the world did not fall into war by accident. It fell because it had been standing at the cliff's edge for far too long, and because no one had the wisdom or the courage to step back. And when the plunge finally began, the world awoke to a reality more terrifying than anything its leaders had imagined. The armies that had been polishing their uniforms and sharpening their bayonets now moved with mechanical precision, marching toward a destiny none of them truly understood. Millions were mobilized in days, carried by trains that screamed across the continent, transporting youth toward a war whispered to be glorious, promised to be swift, yet destined to become a nightmare without end. The age of gentlemen's battles was gone. A new era of warfare, brutal, industrial, and unrelenting, had begun. The first battles shattered every illusion. Commands, written in elegant handwriting, collided with the grim truth of modern weaponry. Machine guns tore through ranks that marched as if still living in the century before. Artillery shells exploded with thunder that shook the earth, sending steel fragments slicing through flesh and bone. Soldiers who had left their homes envisioning victory parades now found themselves drowning in mud, choking on smoke, and watching friends collapse in silence. The promises of glory dissolved in the first hour of combat. The war was no longer a contest of bravery. It had become a test of endurance. Trenches carved into the landscape stretched farther than any eye could see, networks of mud, wire, and suffering. They were meant to protect, but they became prisons where life and death stood separated by inches. The men inside these trenches lived under constant threat. Snipers waiting for the slightest movement, shells raining unpredictably, and gas drifting silently in the night. Rain turned the earth into sludge that swallowed boots whole. Winter froze fingers until they could barely hold rifles. Sleep came in fragments. Food arrived stale. Letters home were the only reminders that another world still existed. The machines of destruction evolved faster than hope. Tanks emerged, steel beasts rumbling over the battlefield, crushing wire and infantry alike. Their engines roared like monsters born from the very chaos of war. Above, airplanes transformed the skies into new battlefields, their wings trembling as pilots dropped bombs or fired machine guns in deadly dances among the clouds. Submarines lurked beneath the oceans, striking without warning at ships that once sailed unafraid. The war expanded beyond borders, beyond oceans, beyond imagination. But the greatest weapon was not steel or fire, it was fear. The constant dread of death seeped into every corner of a soldier's mind. Days blurred into nights, and nights into endless waiting. Some prayed, some cursed, some stared at the horizon with empty eyes, knowing that the next whistle to charge might be their last. Yet even in this terror, humanity flickered. Soldiers shared stories, songs, and rare moments of laughter. They carved memories into trench walls, clung to photographs of family, and held tightly to the hope that someday the world would remember what they had endured. Behind the lines, civilians faced struggles just as heavy. Entire cities transformed into factories of war. Women stepped into roles once denied to them, operating machines, producing weapons, and keeping nations running. Families rationed food, coal, and hope. Telegrams arrived with cold, merciless clarity notifications that a father, brother, or son would never return. Streets filled with silence each time a messenger walked by, for everyone feared that knock on the door. Across the world, the conflict spread, pulling distant lands into its storm. Colonies sent soldiers who fought on foreign soil for empires they had never seen. Deserts, mountains, seas all, became battlefields. The war consumed not just Europe, but humanity itself. There was no safe distance, no untouched land, no life wholly separate from its reach. Strategies grew more desperate as the years dragged on. Generals on both sides became trapped in their own calculations, believing that just one more push, one more assault, one more sacrifice would break the stalemate. Yet every advance measured in yards was paid for with thousands of lives. Entire divisions vanished in minutes under relentless shelling or suicidal charges. The land itself became unrecognizable forests, reduced to splinters, villages erased, fields turned into craters, filled with water that stank of death. And through it all, the machines evolved. Chemical weapons spread across the wind, burning lungs, blinding eyes, and leaving survivors scarred forever. Artillery could now fire shells dozens of miles away, killing soldiers who never saw their attackers. The world had entered a new dimension of warfare, where distance no longer meant safety, and courage no longer guaranteed survival. The psychological toll became as devastating as the physical. Many returned from the front lines haunted, shaking, unable to speak of what they had seen. The term shell shock entered the world as vocabulary, a small phrase for an ocean of trauma. Those who had believed themselves invincible realized that no soul could stand unscarred in a war built by machines of destruction. Yet even as the war devoured lives, it exposed truths long hidden. Old empires, once seen as eternal, revealed their cracks. Monarchies that had ruled for centuries began to crumble under the strain, unable to sustain the war's demands. Revolutions erupted, governments collapsed, and the political map of the world began to fracture. The age that Europe had known, the age of aristocrats, empires, and imperial pride, was dying on the battlefield. Innovation and devastation marched together. Scientists raced to create new weapons, but others worked to save lives, developing mobile X-ray units, blood transfusion techniques, and advanced medical practices that would shape the future. In the darkest of times, humanity's ingenuity revealed both its best and its worst. By now, the war had become something no one could control. It grew beyond leaders, beyond nations, beyond the reasons it had begun. It had become a force, a relentless tide, consuming everything in its path. Soldiers on both sides fought not for triumph, but simply to survive. Families at home waited not for victory, but for the war to finally end. The machines of destruction had transformed the world forever. They had reshaped how wars would be fought, how nations would defend themselves, and how humanity would view its own capacity for violence. Nothing, not armies, not borders, not even belief itself, would ever again be the same. And still, despite the suffering, the world continued forward, stumbling through the darkness, searching for an end that seemed forever just out of reach. The thunder of artillery had barely faded before a new, more terrifying rhythm began to shape the world, a rhythm of escalation, of desperation, of nations pulling every surviving thread of strength into the machinery of war. What began as a series of desperate maneuvers on battle-scarred fields now grew into something far larger, something that reached into the homes, factories, and hearts of millions. No corner of life remained untouched. The conflict demanded bodies, demanded labor, demanded loyalty, demanded a future that none could yet imagine. And as the war spread, so too did the realization that this struggle would not stay contained to the trenches. It would climb into the skies, descend into the seas, and reshape the very notion of modern warfare. The once stable world now teetered on a precipice as entire governments redefined themselves overnight to sustain the conflict. Men who had never lifted more than a tool were now handed rifles and thrust into the jaws of battle. Women stepped into factories with an urgency that rivaled the soldiers' march to the front. The clatter of machines replaced the hum of daily life. Forging shells, tanks, aircraft frames, each stamped with the understanding that survival depended on outproducing, outmaneuvering, and outlasting the enemy. The war was no longer fought solely by those who carried bayonets. It was now propelled by every citizen, every hand that could turn a leva, roll a bandage, or decode a message. The lines between battlefield and homeland blurred until they nearly vanished. But even as nations mobilized, the conflict muscled its way into realms no one had imagined would become arenas of war. The sea, once a highway of trade and exploration, became a silent graveyard. Submarines, gliding unseen beneath gray waters, stalked merchant ships with cold precision. If you found this story compelling, please consider subscribing. We dive deep into the events that have shaped our world, bringing history to life. Thanks for watching. The ocean, once a symbol of boundless freedom, now felt suffocating. An invisible menace lurked beneath its waves, ready to strike without warning. The old rules of naval warfare were gone, replaced by a new, unforgiving reality. Civilians on passenger ships were no safer than soldiers on the front lines. A torpedo has no conscience, no hesitation, no regret. With every ship that sank, a wave of panic washed over coastlines far and wide. Above them, the sky was also transforming. What was once a canvas of freedom became a new domain of danger. At first, aircraft were fragile things. Canvas wings stretched over wooden frames, their engines sputtering in protest. But in just months, these delicate machines evolved into tools of reconnaissance, and then into weapons of mass destruction. Pilots climbed into their cockpits knowing they were entering a battlefield with no trenches to hide in, no earth to absorb the blows. The dogfights that erupted between the clouds were fierce, intimate duels of instinct and daring. Victory hinged on a single turn, a single second, a single burst of gunfire. Down below, cities looked up with a growing fear. The sky, once a place of dreams, now carried shadows that could drop fire upon their streets and homes. As the world watched these terrifying transformations, scientists worked in secret, racing to outpace the enemy essay innovations. Every new tactic demanded a countermeasure. Every new weapon required an equal or greater response. Poisonous gases drifted across windswept fields, choking entire battalions. This sparked a desperate scramble to develop masks, filters, and antidotes. The line between survival and annihilation now depended as much on laboratories as it did on frontline trenches. And with each breakthrough, the war grew more impersonal, more mechanical, more devastating. It was no longer a contest of armies, but a test of human ingenuity pushed to its darkest limits. Diplomats tried desperately to hold the collapsing world together, but their pleas were drowned out by the roar of cannons. Letters exchanged between governments carried the weight of life and death, as alliances formed or shattered with a single signature. Some nations hesitated, caught between the fear of joining the carnage and the fear of being swallowed by it later. Others seized the moment, seeing opportunity in the chaos. And when new players finally stepped onto the global stage, the conflict swelled beyond anything the world had ever imagined. Fresh troops crossed oceans, determination etched on their young faces, unaware they were marching into a war that had already consumed millions. On the front, the pressure was unbearable. Commanders, exhausted by years of failed offensives, gambled on strategies born of sheer urgency. They pushed their soldiers to the absolute limits of endurance, ordering attacks through mud that swallowed boots whole, past barbed wire that tore flesh and fabric alike. The ground became a hellish mosaic of craters, shattered trees, and twisted metal. Uniforms, once vibrant with color, were now stained by blood and rain. And yet, the fighting surged forward, driven by the faint belief that one decisive blow could finally tilt the balance. As exhaustion seeped into every division, morale began to waver. Letters from home brought comfort, but also painful reminders of what had been lost. In hushed tones, soldiers spoke of friends buried in makeshift graves, of leaders making promises they no longer believed. Sometimes, an eerie silence would settle over the battlefield, a quiet that felt more unsettling than the constant thunder of war. But even in the midst of despair, there were moments of unexpected humanity. a shared cigarette with an enemy prisoner, a brief ceasefire to collect the wounded, a fleeting sunrise casting golden light over the shattered ground. These small fragments of grace were reminders that beneath the uniforms, beneath the commands, beneath the hatred that war demanded, were just people. People who once worked in fields, studied in classrooms, and kissed their children goodnight. Still, the war pressed on, grinding hope under its heel. The economic strain tightened its grip on every nation. Food shortages turned markets into battlegrounds of their own. Families rationed every crumb, while government posters urged sacrifice with a patriotic optimism that felt utterly disconnected from reality. An entire generation grew up in the shadow of conflict, learning to measure time not by calendars, but by casualty lists. The war had become a world within the world, inescapable, relentless, and constantly hungry for more. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the momentum began to shift. New resources poured into the conflict. New strategies were formed, and new alliances solidified. Fresh troops arrived to replace the weary ones who had fallen, revitalizing fronts that had seemed on the brink of collapse. Industrial output soared, despite the hardships, delivering weapons and machines faster than they could be destroyed. A sense of inevitability began to creep into the high command knot. A belief in an easy victory, but an understanding that the tide was finally turning. Nations that once seemed invincible now felt the immense weight of their overextension. Their supply lines frayed, their morale cracked, their certainty faltered. Pressure mounted from all sides as the conflict entered its final, most desperate phase. The war had carved deep scars across continents, but now, the fractures within armies and governments became impossible to hide. Some soldiers mutinied, refusing to continue senseless charges. Citizens flooded the streets, demanding peace. Leaders faced a world that had grown weary beyond measure, a world teetering between collapse and hope. And with each passing week, the realization spread. The foundations of empires, long considered unshakable, were crumbling. The fighting continued with a fierceness born of cornered desperation. Offensives erupted with chaotic intensity, as nations tried to secure any last advantage before defeat or negotiations forced their hand. But the winds of war had shifted for good. Once dominant forces staggered under the weight of internal turmoil and the relentless advance of newly energized opponents. As battered troops fell back and governments sent frantic messages seeking terms, the world inched toward the end of a conflict that had reshaped everything it touched. When the guns finally fell silent, the world did not erupt in celebration. It exhaled in disbelief. Across the scarred landscapes, men emerged from trenches like ghosts from another lifetime, their faces hollowed by experiences too vast for words. Cities counted their missing. Families searched for names on endless lists. And nations stood in the heavy quiet of a dawn that felt completely unfamiliar. Peace had arrived, but the world that once existed was gone. It had been buried long before the armistice was signed. Borders were redrawn, empires collapsed, and governments toppled. The victors, though triumphant, carried the same exhaustion as the defeated, for everyone had paid a terrible price. The map of the world was redrawn by hands that trembled with the memory of what unchecked ambition had unleashed. Treaties declared an end to all wars, yet beneath the ink lingered resentment, fear, and the seeds of storms yet to come. But in that fragile moment, between what had been destroyed and what was yet to be rebuilt, humanity faced its own reflection. It saw how quickly civilization could descend into chaos, how innovation could be twisted into devastation, and how pride could silence reason. And yet, it also saw resilience. Millions rebuilt their homes with trembling hands, planted fields again, reopened schools, and searched for meaning in the ruins. They understood that survival wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a new responsibility, a duty to ensure that the world would never again be allowed to slide so willingly into the abyss. The war had ended, but its echo would shape generations. The cost was counted in lives, in stolen futures, in the innocence of an age lost forever. And as the world stood on this new horizon, one truth settled into every heart. History would remember this conflict, not only for its destruction, but for the warning it carried etched in mud, fire, and millions of silent graves that peace is never guaranteed, and its preservation is the work of all who inherit the dawn that follows the darkest night. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing for more deep dives into the events that shaped our world.